Eddie, thanks for being here this week.
Thank you so much for having me.
Anytime. So I wanted to talk to you because you're with Forward.us, a group that represents a lot of different priorities, but you focus specifically on pro-immigration policies. And I think that something that has been lost in this whole conversation around COVID-19 is how undocumented people have experienced this. And I know a lot of people that have gone to testing sites and obviously been contacted by contact tracers to get their information, but when you're living as an undocumented person, I have to assume that that is just a totally different experience. Can you tell me what you've been hearing from the community?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and great question. One of the things we've been hearing from the community from the beginning of this pandemic is that information wasn't getting to them, accurate information wasn't getting to them, and also the translated version of information wasn't getting to them. So that was one of the big, and continues to be quite a hurdle in the our communities, and particularly undocumented community, and communities that don't speak English. So that was one of the hurdles. The other hurdle is like understanding where this the political climate and where the Trump administration anti-immigrant sentiment stands. Folks were afraid to seek medical help, and also whether that's in the hospitals or getting tested because they were asking for a form of IDs, and it wasn't necessarily very clear as to what they would do with that information, who holds it, and whether that was some type of federal efforts to
That's
keep
what
it.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's what I was wondering is, was the undocumented population maybe have a trend towards not seeking care and maybe not seeking testing, and that could have had a domino effect, I guess, into spreading the disease in those communities in ways that didn't happen in other communities?
Yeah, and that's part of the sort of issues that we've been having, right? You have an administration that has been anti-immigrant since, Trump first ran for office in 2015. And so that has continued on with the deportation pipeline, with the family separation. And so that's added the anxiety in our communities in seeking help. And we've seen sort of the numbers, including in undocumented immigrant communities, because they are at the front line of this pandemic, fighting it, and also contributing to the economy in agriculture, but also not retail, in groceries and deliveries, et cetera. So we've seen this sort of effort to undermine this health crisis by the Trump administration. And these communities and these individuals should be one of the first people to get tested and have that readily available, given that they are at the front line.
You know, speaking of the administration, obviously we're right in the middle of the census count. It's going on for at least another few months, but I think it was 2 years ago that the Trump administration said that they wanted to ask about citizenship on the census, and then earlier in 2019, the Supreme Court struck down that decision. And at the time, I was covering that case because I was a reporter in a different outlet. And there was this theory at the time that even though the question was struck down, that it would still have an effect on the census. In other words, that undocumented people would still be hesitant to fill out the census, and therefore New York may have an undercount. Are we seeing that happen a year later after the Supreme Court struck that down?
Yeah, you've seen the effects of the fear and making sure that people are pushed back into the shadows. And then in the midst of that, you throw the pandemic and the continuous rhetoric that is coming from our national and federal government. And that does create a particular challenge to reach these individuals that need to be counted. So we've seen that throughout New York City, but also throughout New York as a whole.
Now, there's also a new directive from the president that's kind of bouncing off of that Supreme Court decision that he wants undocumented people not to be counted for reasons of apportioning seats in Congress. In other words, he just wants the documented population to be counted towards divvying up the seats that each state has in the U.S. House of Representatives. Tell me why you're against that. I could see the devil's advocate point of view that people would say, well, shouldn't people that are here and legally citizens, shouldn't they be the determinative factor of the number of representative seats? Tell me your position.
Yeah, I want to be clear about, the framers of the 14th Amendment were very clear on this, right? Everyone within the state boundary should and needs to be counted. And this is not just for the sort of availability of congressional seats. This is also has ties to federal funding, right? In the midst of this economic crisis, these numbers determine what these localities get in federal funding for the next 10 years. So this is not just affecting areas in blue states or blue areas, but this is also affecting rural areas that will depend on an accurate census count in order to be allotted federal aid.
All right, Eddie Taveras from Forward.us, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.